record. Yes. So impressed with myself.
Good.
Okay, fine. So Patrick O'Connor, welcome to Alice in Dunderland. Patrick is a former financial services executive who's now a human rights advocate with lived experience in managing severe mental illness. After being diagnosed with complex PTSD, MDD, and severe anxiety shortly after his 40th birthday, he immediately retired to focus full-time on treating his conditions. 5 years after navigating the Australian mental health system, Patrick moved to the US to access treatments not available here in Australia. These treatments include intravenous ketamine infusions for depression, psychedelics, and medical cannabis for anxiety. In the financial services sector, he's well known for his campaigning for the improvement in the treatment of people on mental illness insurance claims. He was an integral part of the Banking and Finance Royal Commission that uncovered systemic failures in this area. After 3 years of research and at a cost of over $300,000, in 2020, Patrick published a report titled Prescribed Deaths, Life in the Killing Zone. Written with the assistance of doctors from Harvard and Yale, the report details the systemic issues with prescription medications in Australia. The report was the core part of the Australian Human Rights Commission's first complaint against the Commonwealth of Australia for alleged human rights violations due to prescription medications. Patrick is currently working with members of federal parliament and the media to bring some of the report's recommendations to action. So welcome. That's a lot.
Thanks, Karen.
Isn't it? That's a lot to have gone through, really. And I imagine that the reason that you've embarked upon all of that is obviously because of your own, what happened to you. Yeah. And can you give us a brief rundown as to, I mean, there's the change in the way of dealing with mental health problems now, you know, not in that it's becoming at least part of what happened to you as opposed to what's wrong with you, right? I mean, but that's in theory to a very large extent. It's certainly not practiced by everyone who's actually working in the mental health system, and a lot of damage is done by not asking that simple question, really. And there's always a trajectory that leads you to, you know, what happened to you. So you're ending up with those diagnoses was a result of.
Yeah, I went and saw my GP at the end of 2012. I was working in Sydney in the financial services sector, and it was 20 minutes later, I walked out with a diagnosis of anxiety and depression. I had a referral to see a psychologist, and I had prescriptions for antidepressants and anti-anxiety medication. And I remember just standing out the front of the doctor's office, literally just having a what the hell just happened moment. I mean, that was just incredibly quick, you know, a few questionnaires, a few, you know, yes, no answers. And next thing, you know, I'm standing there with, or about to start to take, or commence a 5-year journey of significant medication without very little understanding of what I was about to do. And certainly the diagnosis at that point was, you know, it wasn't accurate. And the medication prescribed was always going to be highly ineffective. So, you know, 5 years later, and I'd tried over 50 different types of medications. And if you look at the combinations of medications, as doctors like to prescribe, it would have been in the literally, you know, 300 to 400 different combinations of medications. The diagnosis changed on 5 different occasions, and I ended up, I think I went through 3 psychiatrists. And you know, reached a point at the end of 2017 where I was worse than I'd ever been. And it was clear to me, and I'd had, you know, probably about 100 hours of therapy, of talking therapies as well, mainly psychologists, that, you know, I was worse than I ever was. And, you know, it got to that point where I wasn't sure whether it was the medication side effects, whether it was my mental health conditions, whether it was comorbid factors. So I made a decision then to move to the US to get treatment with some psychiatrists there. And And one of the, I guess the light bulb moment for me was, they looked at everything and they said, look, we just can't see where you've ever been diagnosed properly.
Mm.
So we went through a process of reviewing the diagnosis, but we also went through a really broad spectrum of blood tests, which uncovered that I have low testosterone.
Mm-hmm.
It also uncovered a couple of liver and kidney function issues as well.
Mm.
And we did some DNA testing, which is great about trying to be more specific about your genetic profile and your predisposition, to mental health conditions, and then which medications are likely to be successful. So, a lot of my journey in the US was literally just going back 5 years and starting again.
Yeah, I mean, and that was going to be part of my next question, because a lot of what you've said is the wisdom of hindsight. Yes, that when you first went to your GP and came out 20 minutes later with a prescription, etc., at that time, did you have any idea of the wrongness of that? Apart from thinking that it was strange, did you have any insight into the disaster that it could become?
I didn't have, I think everyone goes to the GP, whether it's coughs or colds or, musculoskeletal issues, soft tissue issues, whatever. Mm-hmm. And you put a huge amount of faith in the doctor. My GP was great GP, but what's really apparent now is that, that there should never have been a diagnosis in such a short time frame. And I was given no opportunity to talk to him about work stresses, life stresses, relationship stresses. I was heavily self-medicating with alcohol at that point in my life. There were plenty of things that I was doing that impacted my health and mental health at that point in time. And that was not information that was given to the GP. Wasn't asked in any way about, long suffering trauma, or was there any issues that, were affecting me. And, if you don't give that information to the GP, well, how the hell are they going to get the diagnosis right? And if they don't get the diagnosis right, then the medication is never going to be right.
Absolutely. And it's taking you and taking anyone in this situation back to that point of original diagnosis. Yeah. And there's always preceding factors. There's always an environment that you're reacting to, work stresses, relationship issues, self-medicating, etc., which is pretty much par for the course, for many people's ways of dealing with life problems, really. And if you walk into your GP with the effects of all of that, really, which is obviously going to be depression and anxiety and highs and lows, and self-medicating and then non-self-medicating and all of that sort of stuff, all of that turbulence, and if none of that is part of the conversation that happens between you and your doctor, then as you say, there is bound to be a very big risk of a misdiagnosis right at the beginning.
Yeah, and we have mental illness. There is no pathology test for diagnosis. There's no blood test. There's no X-ray. It comes down to essentially what information do we give our doctors?
Yes.
How do they interpret that? How do they then use their experience to make a diagnosis? I mean, the opportunity for human error is huge right through that process. Which that's the world we live in. However, when you get to the point where the medication, and I'm not anti-medication, I'm very much about pro-informed consent.
Yes.
Is that if I'd been told when I was walking out that the anti-anxiety medication had a huge risk of addiction and dependence, if I was told that taking that medication with alcohol had a high likelihood of respiratory depression, coma, or death, there would have been a lot more questions asked. And in the area of the antidepressants, I had no idea about the withdrawal effects of Effexor, and it was a medication that took me from that day till I came off it about 7 years. And, I tried on countless occasions to come off that medication, and like a lot of people do, you end up staying on it because you can't find a way off it. But the other side effects around sedation, weight gain, sexual dysfunction, blood pressure, all these things become a cumulative effect, and you end up sitting in front of a doctor and you're talking to them about how you're feeling and your side effects, and not once do they say, oh, that's due to the medication, it's always, well, that's because of your mental illness. Like, well,
Absolutely.
it's like, well, you know, we need, if you don't get given that information up front to make an informed consent, which is the law, then you not only are you guess you're not giving consent, but going down a pathway to a treatment program where you actually have no idea what you're in for. So you're not aware of it and you not take the risks around that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and getting back to that point of informed consent, you know, a lot of what you've just said is the result of you having gone in search of your own answers, yes, and hence going to the States, you know, and it's that thing of, you know, the vast majority of people that I know who have ended up in similar situation to you, you know, at that initial consultation, there's no way that they have the information that they need, and they're not given that information, that, you know, what's about to happen to them is going to send them down a path that's potentially disastrous, you know, certainly life-changing, and, you know, could have been avoided right at that instant of having a conversation with your GP if different questions were asked, you know, if different questions were asked. So, and it's always that thing as well that so much of this, you know, comes down to lived experience. You would not have this experience, you would not be doing what you're doing now. I mean, you obviously had that, I guess, sense of justice and rightness when we're talking about working with the insurance company and playing some part in bringing about the Royal Commission into banking. Yeah, so that's part of your character. And that's played into, you know, the investigation that you've done since as a result of your diagnoses. But one of the things that I was interested in when we spoke last time was that going to the States, you found a different climate there. Yeah, a very different climate there, had, you know, different conversations, you know, re-diagnosed and all of that. Can you tell me, you know, in more detail how that was?
Yeah, I think one of the aspects about the US that I probably need to clarify is that I do talk about that there's my experience in the US was incredible and it was, you know, it was life-saving, but that was from the perspective of someone who had the financial means to pay for the best doctors. So, you know, the system as a whole is inherently broken, but as far as finding, you know, the best doctors and the best treatments that I could have imagined, the US certainly was able to offer those. And you know, that they view mental illness very differently over there. It's very much a holistic, whole of body process. They realize that, and they're very clear that, you know, they don't want to rush into prescribing a treatment or medications or any other type of intervention until they're really comfortable about how your whole body is operating. And by that I mean, you know, that the broad spectrum blood tests that I had uncovered a number of you know, issues that I had around the liver and kidneys. Also, you know, it was very clear that I had severe sleep apnea, and I had virtually well, no testosterone. I wasn't producing it at all. So there's a number of factors that needed to be addressed, because all of those impact your level of energy and your overall health and mood and well-being. So, you know, it was about, well, we need to address these, and then secondary now look at your mental health perspective. Is there actually mental health conditions there, or are you experiencing the side effects of low testosterone and sleep apnea? And you know, it was very comfortable that there was childhood trauma there that was that had a profound impact on my life. So that was okay. Well, then we need to address that, and hence we went down, looked at through DNA testing, identify different medications that may or may not work. And at that stage, I tried so many different medications that we knew that there was not much of a chance success there. So we moved straight into a ketamine IV treatment. And that was great about, you know, really bringing me back from a point of severe depression and getting me to a more functional state. And that was definitely life-saving and life-changing. But being able to access psychedelics and have psychedelic assisted therapy was a real big step forward in the later years.
Can I just take you back to one point, that when you initially had blood tests, etc., that showed that you had low testosterone problems with your kidneys and whatever else it was. I imagine that even at that stage, both you and your doctor would have been aware that those could also have been caused by the medications that you've been on for an extended period of time, rather than that having been, your state of being, your state of your body before you took the medications, correct?
I knew from some blood tests I had just before I saw my GP in 2012 that there was some issues around my kidney function. And we're comfortable that was a result of having a high protein diet and doing a lot of physical exercise. And but the extent to which the liver and kidney functions had deteriorated 5 years later, there's no question that that's a result of the medication, because that's the only thing that changed.
Correct.
I stopped drinking alcohol at that point of diagnosis, and so there are a lot of things that I improved: healthy living, healthy diet. So I do believe that, yes, you're right, that the medication impacted those aspects, but the low testosterone was diagnosed. It was definitely a genetic condition that was prevalent in my family. But I had never been tested for that previously. And doctors in the US were amazed that, that it's part of the course now for males over the age of 40, that they're testing for low testosterone to see if that is a contributing factor in mental health conditions.
And another point that what you've just said, is instantly raised for me, and part of your bio is that you had some involvement with what is it, UNHCR?
The Human Rights Complaint.
That's right. Yes, that Human Rights Commission thing. Which is Scientology. Yes. No,
that was my complaint against the Commonwealth.
Right.
Supported by the Human Rights Commission.
Right.
Was a separate thing, but the Scientology point that you raised, that Professor Pat McGorry and Professor Ian Hickey are very quick to identify people with lived experience who complain about the side effects of medication. They are by a strong level of inference part of the Church of Scientology, because the Church of Scientology has an arm or a business that does raise awareness around the side effects of medication. A lot of their stuff actually makes a lot of sense. However, being associated with the Church of Scientology has other, sometimes not particularly pleasant stigma attached to it. I have no involvement with the Church of Scientology. I've never met anyone from it that I'm aware of.
Yeah.
But the two professors are in the press as saying and very clearly inferring about myself and others as being part of that, because we raise awareness around medication side effects.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and it's, and that was the gist of what I was trying to get at there, because a lot of people, who really have not had the experience that you've had, and many other people, will automatically come at this from if you're questioning the role of the medications and the effectiveness of the medications, you will instantly be lumped in with Scientology, and therefore, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And it's that undermining of credibility to a very large extent, really, when it comes down to it. The Church of Scientology, the evidence that they've amassed over however many years, for whatever reasons, is pretty much what a lot of this is based upon. It's looking at the side effects, it's looking at the withdrawals from these medications, it's looking at there being no blood tests, etc., to be able to determine a mental illness in the first place. And it's that, it's that thing of coming from the medical or biomedical perspective that will instantly undercut and undermine conversations and arguments like this, purely because it threatens their credibility to a certain extent. And it's looking at the consequences, really, the consequences that you've suffered, the consequences of, that vast numbers of people around the world have suffered because of a lack of awareness, a lack of education, a lack of honesty, a lack of integrity, and a lack of, the right questions and the right conversation being had right at the beginning that, sent you down this path, which, as you said, if you had not had the financial wherewithal to be pursuing these alternative routes, chances are that you would be, another statistic of someone who's just a mental health patient for the rest of their days.
Yeah,
that you would have seen. Yeah.
definitely.
And that's the human rights side of things.
Well, the human rights complaint was my experience, and then the report prescribed deaths detailing more specifically drug by drug the side effects, the risks, and the failures of the healthcare system. And the complaint was originally lodged directly with the federal government, the Department of Health, and TGA. The TGA's response was quite interesting. It wasn't that we don't agree that these side effects and risks exist. It was that it's not our job to tell people.
Right. So we'll know what's going on, but it's not a matter for us to tell the public what's going on.
And
did you see a problem with that response?
Well, it was in breach of the Therapeutic Goods Act. I mean, the Therapeutic Goods Act is very clear about the consumer medication warnings, which are provided either on the package or in the consumer medicines information leaflets that you can get from the TGA website, or most normally you receive them from your pharmacist. Though the Act is very clear about that all known risks and side effects that have a potential to impact, of course, hospitalisation or death have to be noted in those leaflets. And the TGA, when pressed further by the Human Rights Commission, so they took the original response from the TGA and then made that a human rights complaint against the federal government to say, well, clearly the TGA is not doing their job. The final response from the Commonwealth was that actually the TGA has never audited or regulated the information that goes in those leaflets, and it's left solely to the discretion of the pharmaceutical companies.
Right.
So that means for the last 22 years, there's never been a consumer warning leaflet go to the public that's ever been reviewed by the TGA.
Right.
Despite the fact that that's their job, and despite the fact that the TGA website actually says that this is the source of truth for drug warnings.
So do you see a conflict of interest between the pharmaceutical companies being the authors of these drug information? Is there some conflict of interest there by any chance?
Well, it's essentially they're in breach of the law, because what we did through the prescribed deaths report was compare the same warning information that they give consumers in the US for the same drugs. And what you could see there is, say, a drug like Valium. In the US, it warns against addiction, against dependence, tolerance, overdose, and death on 10 times. Yet in Australia, those warnings for Valium have never been included once since 1998.
Really?
So same drug company. So Roche Pharmaceuticals clearly made a decision to delete those more severe warnings when they provide the information here in Australia, and because the TGA doesn't review those warning documents, they say that they've never picked it up. I don't believe that for a second. They've just made a very conscious decision to not go there and not force them to do what they're required to do.
Right. So taking into account that certainly one of my preconceptions about this issue in the States is, for a start, that they have free-to-air advertising of psych medications, and we don't here. New Zealand, we don't, do we?
No, we don't. I'm not. I think the advertising probably is overplayed in a lot of places certainly by medicos in Australia as being a reason why the US has medication problems. The fact is that Australia is the second highest user of antidepressants and antipsychotics in the world. So we don't have any advertising, but we don't seem to have too much trouble from the doctor's perspective prescribing them. So, the evidence doesn't stack up that the fact that there is advertising in the US leads to greater usage, because you can't buy it off the shelf. You have to be prescribed it. It does create awareness that if you're sitting in front of a doctor and the doctor mentions Prozac or Cymbalta or something like that, that consumers have heard of it, but they can't buy it themselves. So it really, we don't have that here. And said Australia is well documented with the second highest user of antidepressants in the world and one of the biggest users of antipsychotic medications. So the problem doesn't lie with advertising; it lies with the prescribing practices of GPs and psychiatrists.
Yeah, and I guess it's worth, from my perspective, it's worth elaborating on that issue, because it's easy to have preconceptions, and if you haven't delved into that particular area of things as you have, then you can end up drawing wrong conclusions, really. But it is from a legal perspective, that's what I'm interested in, taking into account Royal Commissions, taking into account the Royal Commission into military suicides. And what I've seen, is it Julianne Finney?
Julianne Finney, yeah.
Attempting to make a very, very clear connection between the medications that are prescribed for in general PTSD, but all of the accompanying bits and pieces, and there being that direct connection between the high suicides and it just, it's just logic, it's just logical that, people who are coming back from war, regardless of which war, regardless of which people, are going to come back wounded and damaged, really horrendously so, and will end up on medications now, particularly now, and that there will be an increased risk of suicide. So making those clear distinctions from the political and the legal perspective, do you see any hope of different outcomes here in Australia?
There's no doubt that the Royal Commission into veteran suicides is going to really highlight, well, the evidence that's presented will highlight the overprescribing of medication to veterans. I know Julianne Finney quite well. She's a close friend, and we work together on a number of projects. And having reviewed coroner's reports from dozens of veterans' suicides, the message is it's a repeating story in that they go to war, they come back with physical conditions through battlefield injuries. So they're heavily prescribed opioid medications. When they are diagnosed with mental health conditions or PTSD, they're then prescribed the range of antipsychotics, antidepressants, and anti-anxiety medications. And then there's other medications that they go that prescribe for other comorbid factors, and these men and women are prescribed 8 to 10 to 12 different drugs, and most of them are Scheduled 4 and Scheduled 8 drugs because they're so lethal, and they're prescribed them all at the same time. So the Royal Commission will expose the over dependence of the ADF and DVA on the doctors that support them, these medications. That's already been shown in the first couple of weeks. The question is whether they're going to make the right changes about looking at alternative treatment modalities, and they've already started to do that in the way of ketamine IV. That is available for DVA veterans now through a number of clinics, which is a good step, but the whole model is systemically broken. But the Royal Commission gives a chance to highlight those flaws. I'm skeptical because they've put a psychiatrist on the commission as a commissioner. I mean, that to me, that's akin as having a Catholic bishop on the institutional abuse Royal Commission, and you just can't have somebody who has that level of connection to the issues overseeing it. But it is what it is, and we'll see what the outcome happens.
Which brings me to one of my other questions, because as part of this whole journey that you've undertaken as a result of what happens to you, and looking at this from a more holistic perspective, coming at it from recognizing that both being in the system and the medications have caused huge amounts of damage in your instance, and I mean and your story is replicated in the hundreds of thousands around the world, really. And what hope do you see from a political perspective
With the current government, none.
Yeah, there you go. Because
Um,
this always comes down to political will. In the end, if there's going to be any really substantial, top-down legislation, consequences, accountability, responsibility, there has to be that change from that perspective. Otherwise, it's a lot of people scrambling around, investigating and discovering, lies and untruths from now until the end of time, and absolutely nothing changes.
okay. Karen, can we pause and resume in 5 minutes?
Yes.
I've just had I'm staying in a hotel and they've just sent me a message about a fire alarm, which I didn't hear. So
Well,
I don't think it's a real fire alarm.
no,
So
but I'll put it on pause.
you can pause. Give me a few minutes,
Yep.
and let me come back to you.
All right,
My
beautiful.
phone's been going off, and I realised that it's the hotel ringing me. So let me come back.
All right. Okay, bye. Beautiful.
Good.
So impressed with myself. Okay, so were we in the middle of something, or was I going to ask you another question?
No, I thought we'd finished.
Okay. That particular side of life.
Yeah.
Okay, so
Sorry, you did ask about politics, and I said that I don't believe that there's much chance of this federal government doing anything. However, I have had a number of meetings with federal Labor politicians, and it's been quite encouraging. And it's easy. Anyone who's had much involvement with politicians, it's easy to be given, a smile and a nod that this is something that they need to do something about, and nothing happens. But my meetings with federal Labor have certainly been the opposite. They've given me a huge amount of time on many different levels of high-ranking MPs, and their position has been quite emphatic back to me in that they acknowledge and agree with all of the issues that have been raised. And had already taken those issues to Greg Hunt, on my behalf, and so there was a lot of work done on their side, to try and get Greg to take some action, certainly on the area of the TGA failures, and we didn't get anywhere, and I feel that was because it's just too big an issue for Liberal to go up against the pharmaceutical industry on. But if Labor are elected, then I'm far more confident that we at least will get a good hearing about having something to be done and actually having some action taken.
Yeah, I mean, and I guess it's that very big chasm between what many people internationally know to be true in regards to this, because they've either been victims themselves or family members have been victims. They've seen family, kids commit suicide. They know the connections between the medications and suicide, homicide, and lifelong disabilities and all of that. So the connections are fairly obvious and known to anyone who cares to have a look, and then you choose what you believe to be true or not. But if you're someone such as yourself who has the story, as many people do, of recognizing the connection between both ending up in the system and how that damaged you, but the damaging effects of both the diagnosis and the medications themselves, so that becomes indisputable, really, for those who've been through it. That's just a reality. You can't challenge it, and that's the way that I see it. Is that the way that you see things?
I don't think there's much debate with the politicians on the Labor side of things that the model's broken. And there's, I went through some very clinical steps in my meetings with them where I would put down a consumer warning for a drug from the US and put down the consumer warning for the same drug in Australia. And they're holding them up side by side, and they'll put them down and say, well, this is an absolute disgrace.
Yes, absolutely.
So at a very irrefutable level, there's a huge level of agreement and understanding that we need to urgently do something. But we've seen through the last 8 years that the Liberal Party is not. People with disabilities are an afterthought.
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess it's that thing of having ample evidence and experiences, and a level of outrage after the disbelief, and pretty much nothing changes really. And I recognize that change, you know, particularly when we're talking about systemic change, takes a long time, but it involves political will. You know, ultimately it needs to have political will for there to be a change in the system. And you're taking, you know, all the evidence in the world and a level of outrage and disbelief to Greg Hunt, and there being no action, yeah, is pretty much par for the course, really, to a very large extent. And so, you know, that always brings me to this question as to why do people such as yourself, you know, and vast numbers of other people, not look at the original prescribing doctor as being liable, you know, as being guilty of malpractice? Why does that not play a factor in this?
No, I very much do. The 7:30 report story that I did with Lorna Knowles from the ABC in April of this year, where we looked at a young man, Isaac Reese, in Queensland, who was overprescribed 12 different medications. And when there's an open coroner's report, a coroner's investigation at the moment. What was clear through the interim information provided from ARPA and the coroner was that that Isaac was never given the opportunity to give informed consent on any of the medications. And here's a young man who had just left a mental health facility after trying to de-prescribe himself from huge amounts of opioids and anti-anxiety medication.
Yeah.
And his GP then re-prescribed opioids and anxiety medication in a 3-day period, and then he died. And he didn't die from an overdose. He died at therapeutic levels, but you know, his body had just reached a point where that level of medication just caused respiratory depression, which couldn't be revived.
Yeah.
You know, the point that we've raised, and I've worked with the family through writing a submission to the coroner, was that we'd like to see where Isaac was explained the risks of taking these medications, because statistically the risk of him dying from consuming these medications is, you know, it's about 33 times higher than if he wasn't taking these medications. And it's exactly what happened. But we're up against, you know, the College of GPs, because most medication in Australia is prescribed by GPs, and you know, their response is, well, GPs are too time poor to go through this process. But informed consent's a legal right. So, you know, it's nonsensical to say we don't have enough time to tell you about the risks of the medication, but they also don't have enough time to go to the funerals.
Yeah, and I guess it's just that level of latent dishonesty, really, that, you know, if a builder builds you a house and it falls down, you sue him, you know, simple. You know, why is that not possible in these areas when the excuses are so flimsy, and there's that level of culpability, you know, why?
Well, one of the big problems is that if it's a death, that it's, you know, because there's no written documentation, it's the family of deceased versus the doctor. And that's an almost impossible case.
Why?
You know,
Why is that the case when there's an obvious connection and there's obvious guilt?
The main reason is that if there's any if there's a situation where the toxicology report shows that alcohol was consumed or the drugs were consumed in any amount in excess of what was prescribed, it's very easy for the lawyers to say, look, there's very little chance of winning because, you know, the deceased didn't follow the doctor's instructions, even though the doctor's instructions were verbal and that information doesn't exist in written form. You really have to find a situation where someone has taken literally one drug once and died, and then had that opportunity then take legal action. But there's not a lot of penalty for medicos in Australia for wrongful death. So it's not an air.
That's a bit wrong, isn't it? taking into account the number of stories that you hear, that there's very little, very little punishment, very little accountability taken when people die as a result of someone's actions or lack of actions or missteps or whatever,
Medico-legal experts have said to me on a number of occasions that it's long-term disabilities where someone had a large earning potential and they're no longer able to make that money. That's where you'll get interest from the lawyers. But Isaac was a young 20-year-old man without a family and without any debts and without any kids, and the solicitors have essentially said, well, there's not a lot of ability to get a large settlement here, so it's not of interest.
Yeah, and I guess that's, that story and versions of that story is what I've heard from, so many people who's either their children have been diagnosed and medicated and ended up, as a mental health patient for the rest of their days, or, with the side effects of medications, including the things that you ended up with, organ damage, tremors, all of those sorts of things, which are very obvious, and once you do a little bit of, using 2 brain cells at least, the connection is there and it's indisputable. And yet still, the story that I hear from each and every person is that, we had a chat to a lawyer or whatever and were advised that, nothing would happen, which seems to be, there needs to be a change at that very basic level, in that, there needs to be a change in the legal system, which enables people such as that, where the damage, especially taking into account that we're talking about death here, is so obvious, and the connection is so obvious on a constant, and it's not just 1 or 2 or 3 cases, it's hundreds of thousands of cases around the world, and nothing can be done.
Yeah, and you look at the death statistics each year from drug deaths, and drug deaths encapsulates prescription and illegal drugs. Antidepressants and antipsychotics make up the 2 of the top 5 drugs for drug deaths. We're not talking about ice. We're not talking about heroin and cocaine. We're talking about antidepressants and antipsychotics. Combined cause as many deaths each year as road fatalities.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and anyone can find that information if you choose to, including the doctors who are doing the prescribing in the first place. Anyone can find that. Anyone can discover that. It's out there. ABS, blah blah blah. And I guess it just comes down to something has to change. Something has to change. I mean, you were instrumental in having something to do with the Royal Commission into banking, which was, a great and powerful thing to have happen here in Australia. But at the same time, any major consequences from that, did not affect the higher echelon. It's usually those people who wander off scot-free with, a gazillion dollars or whatever in 15 houses, and the reputation might be a little bit tarnished or something, but ultimately there's no real justice that happens in these circumstances.
No, and we're a long way away from justice. I think my goal has always been awareness, to make people aware of the system that they're about to step into, as much information as they can to navigate it, hopefully in a more successful and healthy manner. We're at with the next federal election is, if we can get the more independence that we can get in, I think that's a big plus. And certainly if we can get a Labor government, I'm sure there's other political factors and policy issues. But as far as what we're talking about today, the best chance of change is undoubtedly with a Labor government. But the more independence that we have involved, the better, because people like Julianne Finney, who's running for the Senate, and Jackie Lambie, and there's a number of independents running in the House, that these are issues that they're aware of and that they'd like to see change with, and that's our opportunity now.
Yeah, and I guess there's no point in labouring the point that it's just plain wrong and just plain silly, really. So what hope have you seen really out of this?
Yeah, look, I think the vested interest of pharmaceutical companies is always a great thing if it works for us. And you've seen through the last few years that psychedelic drugs like psilocybin and MDMA are now being put through FDA drug trials, and they're up to stage 3 drug trials in the US for use in a setting with therapy with a psychologist or an accredited therapist. And ketamine is a drug which has many different uses in a mental health setting. It's an anesthetic that's been used for 50 years, but at low dose levels, it can have some amazing benefits. That's already available as a nasal spray, and ketamine IV, which is just using the generic and ridiculously cheap off-the-shelf original ketamine. That's already being used in clinics in Australia as a treatment for severe depression. So, there's a lot of new, of course, medical cannabis as well. For all the negatives of the past and the over-reliance on traditional medications, there is some really positive and very effective medications that are now available around the world, and are slowly working their way here. They've got not having a whole lot of success getting through the TGA, but eventually they will. The short term, it does look very promising for new treatments, but as far as the end-to-end system, we're a long way from seeing solutions that could fix that. But at the very least, if there's people are given more choice, and certainly more choice when the medication that the GPs use are not working, that they can then progress into new treatments. That's a great thing.
And just one final point, because I mean the other side of this is awareness, and I know that since you've returned to Australia, you've gone out into the community and had conversations with people, and also taking into account that as a result of COVID and increased stresses on people from an economic, financial, being able to pay your mortgage, your business has gone down the drain, there'll be a lot of people under immense stress who will then go along to their GP, and many of them will go along to, the same GP that you went to in the first place, if he hasn't sorted himself out by now, or similar versions of, and end up with, pretty much the same story as you, really, because that's the downside of this, in all of the information and all of the awareness raising that's been happening over the last, and it does go back decades and decades. This is just a different wave, really, and so little real substantial change having happened from the point of view of diagnoses, misdiagnoses, medications, and the consequences that come from that, really. And so you having conversations along these lines with people out in the community, what level of awareness do you encounter?
I quoted a while ago was saying that people are not aware, or people are not unaware that they have mental health conditions. They're very aware that the system is broken, and they're afraid of it.
I know.
And I was lambasted for that statement. It's probably not the exact quote, but it's very, very, very similar. And my point is, I talk to people who have no idea about mental health. But if I say, have you heard about the risks of antidepressants, antipsychotics, Prozac, Valium, Effexor? They'll go, yeah, I've heard there's bad side effects. And there's a natural aversion now to go to see, well, there isn't. So I do encounter aversion for people to go to see their GP because they're worried about being prescribed drugs.
Interesting. I mean, and I guess it's, it's that role of technology, I mean, any of us can know this, whether or not we be, someone who's fallen apart, or whether we be the prescribing doctor, or whether we be Greg Hunt or whatever, any of us can know this, really. And people can Google away left, right and centre and find out this information in spades. And they can also do a hell of a lot of self-diagnosing as well, really.
Yeah.
And but it is, it's the fact that we have all of this information, and that comes with its positive and negative effects as well, really. And I guess I just see the sort of response that you've given there, is just exacerbating the amount of anxiety that you will end up with as a result of your business having gone down the drain, and not being able to pay for your kids' education or the mortgage, etc., and all of that stress that just builds up. And if then you add on to that the fact that that there are adverse impacts from the medications, serious ones, and you're going to be on that really shifting sand of indecision of whatever, and that's that's a bit of a minefield. So
I don't disagree with either the statements, but if people, but eventually there will be change. And I, in fairness to the GPs, they're very time poor, right? So 94% of mental health conditions in this country are diagnosed and managed by GPs, and that's not a model that was set up time-wise to be able to accommodate it. And as I said earlier, if people don't give the GP the information the GP needs to make the right assessment, it's impossible for them. To be fair to, if someone's sitting there on a Monday telling the GP how tired and lethargic they are, and don't mention that they've spent the weekend drinking heavily or taking recreational drugs, I mean, look, the GP is never going to get the right treatment. So people have to own their own life too, and be honest in that regard.
And I guess where I've seen this actually work is where you've had a level of awareness and a level of intelligence on both parts, on the part of the person who's sitting behind the desk and in front of the desk, so that conversation actually happens. And yes, you're right. I mean, it doesn't happen if you counting the seconds on your clock. It just doesn't happen. But still, there's consequences. There are consequences. That's it, and those consequences are deadly in many cases. But anyway, Patrick, interesting chat. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your time. No worries. Good luck with it.
All right. Well, thank you. Also, I'm just going to unrecord this. I'm also going to stop recording this.